We're being joined by retired Colonel Rich Alton, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and also the Jamestown Foundation, is joining us live from Washington, D.C. Now, Colonel Alton, let me in fact begin by asking you, with these images that are coming out from the ground, you know, the worst that was expected is happening as we see. There is close combat in some of these densely populated neighborhoods, which is presently underway. We've seen visuals of Israeli tanks and soldiers, in fact, operating in these regions. And Hamas has got its network of tunnels. We've also seen the tactics that Hamas has used. Some of these tactics have been described as the Second World War tactics of Hamas using ammunition that is placed on the Israeli tanks to destroy them. What is your reading of this close combat warfare that is presently going on?
Well, it's good to be with you, and it's an important question that you raise. I think ground combat differs very significantly from the airstrikes and long-distance combat that we've seen so far, because, as you say, it involves people on the ground, sometimes at a distance of just a few meters from one another, sometimes hitting or stabbing or shooting each other at very close range. From a human perspective and a humanitarian perspective, it's pretty bad, and it is sort of a worst-case scenario. But look, ground warfare is, in fact, necessary for certain operational and strategic objectives. So I think from an Israeli perspective and from a military operational perspective, it's not the worst thing that would happen. The worst thing that would happen would be that the attacks of October 7th would essentially be able to be repeated again in future if the platform for them, which is this tunnel network, is not destroyed. And unfortunately, there's no way to do that except for going in on the ground like this.
Right. Now, one would expect, now, considering as to how advanced Israel is militarily, that Israel would resort to certain, you know, what are surgical strikes going after the top leadership of Hamas. And a lot of the top leadership of Hamas is not even present in the Gaza Strip. But instead, what we are witnessing is what even the United Nations has described as tantamount to collective punishment, where it is more and more, it is the common civilians, the common Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who are bearing the brunt of it. Are you convinced about this Israeli tactic, especially of, you know, carrying out these airstrikes in densely populated civilian areas on hospitals and United Nations run school? Is this tactic likely to work in crushing Hamas, or is this just creating a humanitarian disaster?
Well, you've touched on something that is very controversial within the study of war in general and military history, which is siege warfare. So in essence, what we're seeing is not a surgical strike. It is a siege of Gaza City. Not the entire Gaza Strip. I think it must be said that it's clear from the ground movements that they're trying to isolate the northern third, essentially, of the Gaza Strip, Gaza City and its outlying suburbs, if you will, for the purpose of decapitating the political leadership and destroying the tunnel network. Now, siege warfare is allowed under the laws of armed conflict, but it's very controversial. Why? Because it often involves a great degree of suffering and collateral damage for the civilian economy, deaths of civilians and things like that. Yet it is not outlawed by the law of armed conflict either. The question of whether it's appropriate or whether it should be pursued is a political one. What is the cost for an Israeli leader, for instance, to balance the death of his own civilians and the outrage caused in Israel on October 7th, which, let's be honest, no Israel leader could survive in office.
Right.
Or be judged fairly by history.
No, Colonel Alton, if I can just interject there, the question that I was asking was, you know, Israel with its sophisticated army, it can carry out surgical strikes to take out the leadership of Hamas. Instead, what we are looking at is effectively collective punishment. It's not necessarily the Hamas leadership that is suffering. It is the common people, the Palestinians in Gaza Strip, who are bearing the brunt of this mindless violence.
Well, it's not as easy to just hit the political leaders as you've indicated. Now, the mid-level leaders on the ground, they've killed a bunch of those people that were involved with directing the attacks of October 7th. But if you're talking about the Mashals and so forth, resident in Qatar or in other places, the ones that are in the strip are in these tunnels, sometimes dozens or even hundreds of meters under the ground. That's not easy to do. Right. So I'm not a fan of collective punishment, and I think it's important that Israel and that the United States push Israel to allow humanitarian access, to allow aid, and to minimize civilian casualties. I firmly agree with you there. But I don't think that they have an option of just doing precision strikes here. They have to go in after these tunnels.
All right. My final question to you, Colonel, because you've served also in the U.S. Department of State, both as a civilian and a military advisor for the Policy Planning Office. Now, the Americans also have a big role in this conflict. They're not directly involved, but Americans are supplying the Israelis with weapons right from day 2 of this war. Now, the American Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is again in West Asia. The Americans are saying that Israel must look at the tactics that it is employing. How much leverage do you think that the Americans actually have on the Israelis in trying to reduce the temperature there? Will the Americans consider stopping the transfer of weapons and ammunition to Israel to at least stop and call for a ceasefire?
I don't think that that's in the cards. I think that in the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship is that it would never get to the point of a weapons cutoff, because Israel's security is considered a sine qua non for both Democrats and Republicans, with the exception of a small wing of the Democratic Party that does not numerically have enough weight to make that happen. Now, what could happen is what we saw with Yitzhak Shamir and President Reagan in the 80s, where there was a withholding of loan guarantees or some other action. There's no loan guarantees now, but there could be some action that directly reproaches Israeli leadership from the U.S. president. That's almost unprecedented, and it would cause sort of a governance crisis in Israel. So if it gets to that point, President Biden wouldn't need to cut off arms supplies. He would need to unequivocally condemn what the Israeli actions and the Israeli leadership. Now, he'd pay a political price for that too.
Absolutely, indeed. And some would say he'd still pay a political price for backing, what many people are now saying is a humanitarian catastrophe that has been brought about because of American weapons that are being dropped in the Gaza Strip. Thank you very much indeed, Colonel Alvin, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.